April 11, 1968. The Pacific Ocean, roughly 1,500 miles northwest of Hawaii. The surface was calm, stretching endlessly into the horizon, a mirror of deep blue indifference. But 3 miles beneath the waves, in the crushing darkness where sunlight had never penetrated, a tragedy of immense proportions lay in silence. The Soviet submarine K-129, a Gulf II-class strategic missile sub carrying 3 nuclear ballistic missiles, had vanished. It was not just a vessel, it was a tomb for 98 Russian sailors. And for the United States government, it was about to become the greatest prize in the history of espionage. The story of how the United States attempted to steal a 2,000-ton submarine from under the nose of the Soviet Navy begins not with a bang, but with a sound anomaly. When K-129 missed its scheduled radio check-ins, the Soviet Naval Command went into a panic. They launched a massive search fleet. Ships, planes, and submarines scoured the Pacific for weeks. They knew their sub was gone, but they didn't know where. Eventually, defeated by the vastness of the ocean, the Soviets gave up. They assumed the submarine was lost forever in the abyss. But the Americans knew something the Russians did not. The U.S. Air Force had a secret system of underwater hydrophones known as SOS-US, Sound Surveillance System, designed to track Soviet subs. When intelligence analysts reviewed the acoustic data from March 1968, they found a singular catastrophic event, a low-frequency bang followed by an implosion. By triangulating the sound, American analysts pinpointed the location of the wreck with an accuracy of 5 miles. While the Soviets were searching thousands of square miles of empty ocean, the Americans knew exactly where the graveyard was. Enter the USS Halibut. This was a special operations submarine equipped with wire-guided remote cameras, a piece of technology that was bleeding edge in 1968. Under the cover of darkness, the Halibut sailed to the site. They lowered their camera sled, a device nicknamed the Fish, into the black depths. For weeks, they saw nothing but mud and darkness. The crew began to lose hope. And then, a grainy black-and-white image flickered onto the monitors in the Halibut's command center. It was a steel rudder, then a sail, then the distinct outline of a Soviet missile silo. The Halibut had found the K-129. But what they saw shocked them. The submarine had not shattered into a million pieces. It was largely intact, lying on its starboard side at a depth of 16,500 feet, deeper than the Titanic. The discovery was electrifying. Inside that hull were Soviet codebooks, nuclear warhead designs, and cryptographic machines that could allow the U.S. to read Soviet naval communications for years. It was an intelligence goldmine. But finding it was one thing, retrieving it was impossible. The wreck was 3 miles down. The pressure at that depth was 8,000 pounds per square inch. No diver could survive it. No existing cable was strong enough to lift 2,000 tons of waterlogged steel without snapping. The consensus in the Pentagon was that the prize was unreachable. However, the CIA does not like the word impossible. In 1970, a small group of engineers met in a windowless room in Washington, D.C. to discuss Project Azorian. The meeting was led by John Poronsky, a man known for getting difficult things done. The engineers threw out wild ideas. One suggested filling the sub with buoyant ping-pong balls to float it to the surface. Another suggested using rocket boosters. Finally, they settled on the only idea that didn't violate the laws of physics, even if it sounded insane. They would build a giant claw. The plan was to construct a massive ship, unlike anything the world had ever seen. This ship would have a derrick in the center that would lower a 3-mile-long pipe string made of high-strength steel. At the end of the pipe would be a massive capture vehicle, a claw that would grasp the Soviet submarine, lift it off the ocean floor, and pull it all the way up into the belly of the ship. The engineering challenges were staggering. The ship needed to hold its position perfectly steady in the middle of the Pacific Ocean while lowering a pipe the length of 15 Empire State Buildings stacked on top of each other. If the ship moved even a few feet due to wind or waves, the pipe would snap like a twig. But there was a bigger problem than engineering: secrecy. You cannot build a 600-foot ship with a giant derrick in an American shipyard without people asking questions. The Soviets monitored U.S. naval construction closely. If they suspected the Americans were trying to steal their sub, it would be an act of war. The CIA needed a cover story, a lie so big, so bold, and so public that no one would doubt it. They needed a crazy billionaire. Enter Howard Hughes. By the early 1970s, Hughes was a recluse, living in penthouse isolation, known for his eccentricities and his vast wealth. He was the perfect frontman. The CIA approached Hughes's organization with a proposal. The CIA would pay for the ship, an estimated $350 million, or nearly $2 billion today, but Hughes would publicly claim it was his. The cover story? Hughes was going to mine manganese nodules from the ocean floor. It was a brilliant lie. Manganese nodules are real potato-sized rocks on the seabed that contain nickel, copper, and cobalt. Scientists had been talking about ocean mining for years. It was exactly the kind of futuristic, high-risk venture a man like Howard Hughes would undertake. The media bought it hook, line, and sinker. The ship was named the Hughes Glomar Explorer. It was built in a shipyard in Pennsylvania, and it was a mechanical marvel. It featured a moon pool, a massive opening in the bottom of the hull with sliding doors. The idea was to pull the Soviet submarine up through the bottom of the ship and close the doors, hiding the stolen vessel from passing Soviet satellites and spy planes. As construction neared completion in 1973, the deception deepened. The Hughes Corporation hired actors to play ocean miners. They held press conferences showing off fake manganese nodules. They even gave tours of the ship to the press, carefully steering them away from the secret control room that housed the CIA's lifting technology. But as the launch date approached, tension within the White House grew. President Nixon was embroiled in the Watergate scandal. The geopolitical climate was fragile. Some advisors told Nixon to cancel the mission, fearing that if the Glomar Explorer were caught in the act of grave robbing a Soviet naval vessel, it could trigger a nuclear standoff. The Soviets had noticed the strange American ship, but they believed the mining story. A Soviet intelligence report even concluded, "Hughes is a capitalist fool wasting his money on rocks." In the summer of 1974, the Glomar Explorer arrived at the site of the wreck. The crew consisted of a strange mix of roughneck oil drillers who thought they were mining and undercover CIA agents who knew the truth. The atmosphere was tense. They were thousands of miles from home, hovering over a nuclear tomb, about to attempt the deepest heavy salvage operation in human history.
The operation began on July 4, 1974, Independence Day. The massive claw, nicknamed Clementine, was lowered into the water. Section by section, the heavy steel pipe was screwed together and lowered. Down, down, down. It took days for the claw to reach the bottom. Sonar monitors showed the claw hovering just feet above the tragic wreckage of K-129. The operators in the control room, sweating in the recycled air, manipulated the thrusters. The ship's automatic station-keeping system roared, fighting the Pacific currents to keep the vessel perfectly still. "Engage capture," the command came. The giant steel fingers of Clementine slowly closed around the hull of the Soviet submarine. The sensors confirmed a grip. They had it. A 2,000-ton piece of the Cold War was now attached to a string of pipe 3 miles long. "Commence lifting." The hydraulics groaned. The pipe strained. Slowly, agonizingly, the submarine broke free from the mud that had held it for 6 years. It began to rise. 100 feet, 500 feet, 1,000 feet. The CIA agents watched the load sensors. It was working. The impossible heist was actually happening. They were going to steal a nuclear submarine. But as the submarine rose through the crushing depths, the laws of physics began to fight back. The K-129 had been damaged in the original explosion. Its hull was cracked and weakened. As the prize neared the halfway point, about 9,000 feet from the surface, disaster struck. A shudder ran through the Glomar Explorer. The load sensors on the derrick suddenly dropped. In the control room, faces went pale. Acoustic sensors picked up a horrifying sound from the deep, the screech of tearing metal. The control room of the Hughes Glomar Explorer was silent, save for the hum of computers. The crew stared at the monitors in disbelief. 3 miles of steel pipe dangled beneath them, but the weight reading was wrong. It was too light. At a depth of nearly 9,000 feet, the structural integrity of the Soviet submarine K-129 had failed. One of the massive steel fingers of the claw had cracked under the strain. As the claw lost its grip, the submarine snapped in two. The larger section, comprising the aft 2/3 of the vessel, which contained the ballistic missiles and the crucial codebooks, slipped free. The CIA agents watched in horror as the majority of their prize tumbled back into the darkness, falling in slow motion toward the ocean floor. It hit the seabed with a force that shattered it into debris, burying the intelligence goldmine forever. All that remained in the claw was the forward 38-foot section of the submarine. It was a disaster. 6 years of planning, hundreds of millions of dollars, and the most advanced engineering feat in maritime history had resulted in catching only the nose of the fish. The haul and the horror. Despite the failure, the mission wasn't over. They still had a piece of the sub. They winched the remaining section up through the moon pool and into the belly of the Glomar Explorer. When the water was drained and the massive doors were sealed, the CIA teams descended to inspect their catch. What they found was a grim reminder of the human cost of the Cold War. The wreckage was twisted and mangled, radioactive and perilous. They managed to recover 2 nuclear-tipped torpedoes, a significant intelligence find, but not the codebooks they had desperately hoped for. But they found something else, too. Inside the crushed steel of the forward compartment were the bodies of 6 Soviet sailors. These men had died in 1968, waiting in the dark for a rescue that never came. Now, 6 years later, they were aboard an enemy ship. In a moment of profound respect that transcends politics, the CIA Director William Colby ordered that the sailors be treated with full military honors. On September 4, 1974, a strange ceremony took place on the deck of the Glomar Explorer. The CIA agents and American crew stood in formation. A chaplain read a prayer in both English and Russian. The Soviet national anthem was played over the ship's loudspeakers. The bodies of the sailors, placed in a metal container, were committed back to the deep. The entire ceremony was filmed in color, a secret record of honor among enemies. The Thief in the Night. The mission was technically a partial failure, but the CIA planned to go back. They wanted to build a better claw and retrieve the rest of the sub the following year. The cover story of Manganese Mining was still holding. The world was none the wiser. Until a burglar broke into the wrong office. In a twist that sounds like bad fiction, on June 5, 1974, before the Glomar had even finished its mission, thieves broke into Howard Hughes' personal office in Los Angeles. They were looking for cash. Instead, they stole 4 boxes of documents. One of those documents was a handwritten memo describing the CIA's secret project to lift a Soviet submarine. The thieves didn't know what they had, but they knew it was valuable. They tried to blackmail the CIA. The FBI got involved. The situation spiraled out of control. Investigative journalist Jack Anderson got wind of the story. The CIA begged them not to publish, invoking national security. For a while, the press held their tongues. But by early 1975, the Los Angeles Times broke the silence.
On March 18, 1975, the headline hit the newsstands. U.S. reports salvage of Soviet sub. The secret was out. The cover was blown. The Soviet Union was furious. They put their naval fleet on high alert, rushing ships to the site to guard the wreckage. There would be no second attempt. Project Azorian was dead. The Glomar response. As the story broke, reporters swarmed the CIA and the White House. Everyone wanted to know, did you steal a Russian sub? Did you find nuclear missiles? Was Howard Hughes a spy? The CIA was in a bind. If they said yes, it was an admission of an act of war. If they said no, they would be lying, and the evidence was piling up. In a stroke of bureaucratic genius, the CIA's legal team crafted a statement that would become famous. When a journalist filed a Freedom of Information Act request about the project, the CIA replied, "We can neither confirm nor deny the existence of the materials requested." This was the birth of the Glomar response. It is a phrase still used by government agencies today to avoid answering questions without technically lying. It was the legacy of the ship that tried to steal history. The legacy. For decades, Project Azorian was viewed as a billion-dollar failure. Critics laughed at the CIA for spending a fortune to recover a few torpedoes and some old metal. But in recent years, historians have taken a different view. The sheer audacity of the mission proved to the Soviet Union that there was nowhere in the world, not even the bottom of the ocean, where their secrets were safe. It forced the Soviet Navy to spend billions upgrading their security, straining their economy. And then there is the tape. In October 1992, after the fall of the Soviet Union, CIA Director Robert Gates visited Moscow. As a gesture of goodwill, he presented Russian President Boris Yeltsin with a videotape. It was the film of the burial at sea aboard the Glomar Explorer. The Russian officials were stunned. For nearly 20 years, they had believed the Americans had desecrated the bodies of their sailors. Instead, they watched as American intelligence officers stood at attention, saluting their fallen enemies while the Soviet anthem played over the Pacific. It was a moment of closure for the families of the lost sailors. The Hughes Glomar Explorer was eventually converted into a deep-sea drilling ship. It spent decades working in the oil industry before being scrapped in China in 2015. But its legend remains. It was the central character in a story of ambition, failure, respect, and the most expensive claw machine game ever played.